Welcome to Wes Explains Why. In this series, I'm going to be looking at the why behind the moves that grandmasters make. And the first game that I've chosen to look at is the game that was recently played in the Crypto Cup final between Wesley So and Magnus Carlsen. And the game went e4. This is round two. Magnus played c5 and Wesley played knight f3. Magnus goes knight c6 and bishop b5 from Wesley. And now Magnus goes e5. This is an interesting line that's popular lately. And the obvious point is you cannot really take this pawn after bishop takes because dc, knight takes, and then queen d4, and the pawn is hanging, and black gets a good position here. So Wesley castles, and now the threat is real because if knight f6, then takes, and then knight takes e5. And if knight takes e4, then rook e1, and now lining up against this king after knight takes c6 discovered attack. So it's a real threat. So how do you defend this pawn? Well, the most obvious move is d6 in this position. But Magnus played bishop d6, which is also an interesting way of defending that pawn. So Wesley plays c3 here. And now Magnus takes the time to play a6, kicking away this bishop, b5, now making room for his own bishop to come out here to b7. Wesley played bishop b3, and not bishop c2 because that's just too passive. So bishop b3, inviting c4. And indeed, black could play c4 here, and there would be a different type of struggle. But Magnus played what I think was a slightly provocative move, and maybe even a dubious move, knight g to e7, because now after d4 this square is starting to look really weak. Because let's say if pawn takes pawn, then knight g5 hitting f7, and how do you protect that? If you castle, then queen h5 double attack, and now you got to stop mate, so h6, but then knight takes f7 is crushing. So already here Magnus went into a deep think, and he played pawn to c4, which at least I can say the engines don't like this move. But I think that there is the rationale behind this is that it loses the tension on white's center. So white's position is much more solidified thanks to this move, c4. And this pawn later could become a target itself. Plus, as we'll see in the game, this allowed Wesley So to later jump with his knight to d4 because c4 is no longer defended. The engines think Carlsen should have castled here, and after takes, of course, the bishop is hanging. So with the queen, so bishop c7, and bishop e3, c4 is a sample engine line. Bishop c2, bishop e7. This pawn is temporarily sacrificed. Knight b2 to knight g6, and black will eventually regain this pawn and will be able to have a playable position with some dynamism involved. But Magnus instead closed it with c4, but that's kind of losing the tension here in the center. Anyway, bishop c2. And now he played knight g6. And Wesley obviously went for d takes e5. d5 was interesting too. And that would have shown the point of knight g to e7, because then knight would have gone from c6 to e7, which was why knight came to g6 in the first place, to create this square for this knight. And even so, this was the computer's best suggestion for white. And after a move like h4, h5, and g3, white is quite solid, and he's playing for the initiative here. And h5 is weak. Black cannot really castle because this is a loose pawn. So that would have been an excellent way for Wesley to play. But instead he played d5, which is not too bad, because this again poses a question to Magnus about how he's going to solve this problem, because now the bishop is also hanging, and if bishop takes e5, then well, you have lost a huge piece in the position after knight takes. So what to do? You cannot play knight takes. He could play, and he should have played bishop c5, which places this bishop on this nice diagonal. But he was probably, maybe, I'm not sure, but he probably considered queen d5, which hits this bishop, also protects this pawn temporarily. But the engines think that that was still his best move, because queen b6 holds this, and now a sample continuation could be b4 takes, bishop takes, castles, and then bishop a3 trades off the dangerous dark squared bishop. But bishop b7, and it's amazing that black has counterplay after a move like, let's say a bad move like queen takes d7, rook d8, queen f5. He will gang up on that pawn, take it, and even though he's a pawn down, black, according to the engines here, has a lot of dynamic activity after a move like queen f3, queen d8. That's a lot of deep analysis there, and I'm sure that Carlsen, even though he's world champion, would not have been able to see that far. But maybe he thought he was okay after bishop e7 and didn't want to go for bishop c5. Wesley So played dynamically, he played accurately, knight d4, and getting ready to push f4, so forcing Carlsen to take here, and then f4. And now Carlsen is in a problem, because he can play the most obvious move, which is what he did, knight g6, but that's a strategic mistake. Instead, the engines think that his best chance was knight d3 here, sacrificing a pawn with takes, and now even knight takes d4. And after a move like c takes d4, play a5 and bishop a6, and try to get active with your two bishops, and maybe hope for that being enough compensation. But that's what the best chance would have been for Carlsen, but he played knight back to g6. And now Wesley here made a really interesting strategic decision. The engines don't think it's the best move, but I think that from a human perspective, it's a great move, because he played knight takes c6. And after the forced move pawn takes pawn, what he has achieved is he's got a 4 versus 3 majority here. And plus he's got a simple move like queen h5, and he's pushing all his forces towards black's king side. And black really doesn't have any fast counterplay on the queen side, so it's only white who is playing for any sort of activity here, which is, so it's practically an excellent choice by Wesley. Carlsen was afraid to castle, and rightly so, so he played queen b6 check, king h1, queen c5, attacking the queen. So Wesley retreated that temporarily, and now Carlsen castled, but then bishop e3 hits this queen, goes back, and now queen h5 again. And so Wesley's got his ideal queen position, and now with this bishop and queen, he's eyeing h7 soon. So c5, making room for this bishop here, but knight d2, bishop e7, and e5. Now we see that this bishop is coming alive. Not so much on g6, but on h7. And so queen h7 is going to be a threat if this knight moves out of the way. So queen drops back. Keeps an eye on e5, by the way. That's an important point. Wesley plays knight to f3. Now you may think that the idea is to play knight g5 and hit h7, but that's not actually true, because if a move like, let's say, rook d8 and knight g5, then black can simply take on g5, and that's completely okay for black. But the real point behind this move, knight to f3, is to actually hold this pawn on e5. And it will become clear after, let's say, black plays a move like rook a to d8. Then he would play f5, knight takes e5, and f6 here, hitting both these targets, with queen h7 threat is being the threat, and pawn takes bishop being the threat. He cannot stop both because of g6, then queen takes knight, and so that's the point with knight to f3. Black would have to play bishop takes f3 for that reason, and after rook takes f3, he would have to find queen takes e5. Notice the queen was watching e5, because now fg is simply met by queen takes queen. And now white here would have to play rook h3, which defends this queen, also attacks h7. And so black has to go for knight h4. And now he would love to take on h4, but unfortunately after take, black has queen takes e3. So you'd have to waste a move with rook to e1 and then threaten this. But then black can play g6 and mess things up here, which is why Wesley in this position later played rook a to e1 first. But anyway, rook a to d8 was Carlsen's best chance, but he played h6. His idea was that if f5, then now it's simply met by knight takes e5 because you don't have f6 in the position because there is no h7 mate and he can simply take here. And he also plus has knight d3 to throw in if any complications happen on h7. So, but that was not the best way of defending because now this is a huge weakness, and after f5 is eventually played, bishop takes h6 is always in the air. One thing that should be noted is bishop takes g6 is not a move you want to play because, okay, sure, that wins a pawn, but then you've lost your most important piece in the position. And black can play a move like queen c6 and have either you trade queens or black has an excellent battery of queen and bishop on this g2 square, so you'd be well advised to take. But then white's advantage has evaporated, and these two bishops can do a good job of compensating for the extra pawns that white has. So obviously Wesley So doesn't go for that, but instead he goes rook a to e1, which is again reinforcing this point on e5. Now Carlsen doesn't know what to do because if rook a to d8 now, which is still okay, it's an okay move, but all moves are eventually losing in this position. f5, and after bishop takes f3, here Wesley's point would be g takes f3 and not rook takes, because now if queen takes e5, then bishop takes h6 and this rook's on e1. So you see how developing pieces to their optimal square simply allows you for more tactical opportunities like these. So Carlsen, instead of rook a to d8, played queen c6, but now Wesley simply hits him with e6. And that really shows the drawback of this move h6, because now f g6 is not possible, the knight would be hanging. And even queen e6 is not possible because f5 and fork on these two. And if queen d5, then simply rook d1 hits the queen, queen goes back and then takes. So Carlsen played knight to h4 because he's eyeing the g2 square with these queen and bishop. But Wesley here played a simple and an effective combination and pretty much destroyed Carlsen's counterplay completely. He played e takes f7 check. And now if king h8, then Wesley could have played knight takes h4, bishop takes, and taken the time to defend this guy, rook e2. And it may seem that these two pieces are menacing, but white also has ideas of queen f5 and mate here, so that's not happening, plus this bishop is threatened, so he has to go here first. And a simple way of solving this problem would be to play bishop g6 and then play f5 and then go for bishop h6 and moves like that. So that would be completely crushing. This pawn is a huge thorn in black's position. So instead of that, Carlsen took on f7, but that simply allowed queen takes f7 check. Now he has to take, and then knight e5 check. King f8 and knight takes e6. King f8 so that you hold this bishop. Whereas if king g8, then that bishop is loose. So king f8 and then takes and takes. And now he's threatening g2. So Wesley So simply defended that with rook e2. And now the game is practically over. But Carlsen, of course, can't just resign. He has to play on. So he played rook e8. And maybe his plan is to go bishop f6 and then pin this guy. So Wesley So simply moves that away. to a safe square. Bishop d2 is also reasonable because he could have gone bishop e1 after that. So bishop c1 anyway from Wesley. And so he's saying you cannot move this bishop, because if you do, then I simply trade pieces, and that's to my advantage. So Carlsen moved this rook out of the way, and Wesley So now took the time to play king g1. It's a prophylactic move because in many variations, black has bishop takes g2 coming with check to white's king. And so Wesley, by stepping away from that threat, renders that move less effective. And so he has time to, even if black throws in bishop takes g2, he doesn't have to immediately take, and he can do something else in the meantime. So he just sidesteps that check for now, because black doesn't really have any strong threats in the position. So bishop f6 from Carlsen, and now Wesley played a nice move, f5. And he pretty much has got this knight trapped on h4, because the knight has no squares to go to. And all Wesley has to do now, let's say if black plays a move like a5, then play bishop e4, trade off this guy, and then play g3, and that knight would be trapped in the position. So instead of a5, Carlsen played b4, trying to get active here and attacking. And even so, Wesley could have played bishop e4 and saying you got nothing, because if takes, then he just takes, and now g3 anyway, and the knight is lost. And sure, he can throw in this, but bishop takes b2, no problem, the knight is still trapped. But Wesley So played cautiously with bishop d2, no problem. Black doesn't have any real threats here. Carlsen played rook d8, attacking this bishop, so he drops back and keeps an eye on this knight on h4. And now b3, an interesting try. And one may say, okay, why should I take and allow him counterplay like this on the b file? But let's say you don't take it and you play bishop b1. Now this pawn could get really dangerous with a move like rook d1, which is not immediately coming in this position because of bishop takes h4, and rook threatens rook, so you'd have to trade, but then that's just losing. So he would instead play knight takes g2. Here, knight takes, and after takes, now play rook d1, king takes rook d1, and now this bishop is in trouble, so he has to play bishop f2, but then he plays rook d2, attacking this pawn, and it gets really messy here. So Wesley So correctly decided to simply take this guy, take, and after bishop b5, sure, he has to concede the square d4, where Wesley is like, I'm completely fine there, I don't mind giving you that square, but I've won a pawn, and that's something. So bishop c6, and now Wesley's simple plan is rook f4, hitting this knight. And Carlsen has to play rook d4 to protect it, but Wesley simply smiles and takes that rook and reduces Carlsen's counterplay. Bishop takes, and now bishop f2, offering a trade of another piece. And now you see how useful this move king g2 has been, because now there is no bishop takes g2 with check in the position, or even knight takes g2, because bishop takes d4 anyway takes, and then this is just winning. So bishop f2, and Carlsen had to play knight takes f5, getting his knight out, but Wesley says no problem, you can get out, but I simply continue to trade your pieces and you have nothing. And Carlsen in this position resigned because he understood that the game is beyond saving at this point. A sample continuation might have been knight e7, but then Wesley would have simply taken here, take, and now rook d2 hits this pawn, wins that pawn, and then Wesley has a rook for a knight, and that's just winning. So Wesley So won the game. That was not enough for him to win the Crypto Cup final, but nevertheless a great game. And I hope you enjoyed all the whys in this game.